There's something iconic about Christians and money. On one side, people are terrified of risk. Play it safe, save everything, avoid uncertainty, step out too far. But on the other side, you have people calling everything faith. No planning, no wisdom, no structure, just vibes and God told me. And somehow both sides believe they are being biblical, right? Both sides believe they're being biblical, which is impressive because both sides are usually wrong. Because when you study scripture properly, especially in Proverbs, you realize something uncomfortable. God is not against risk, He is against foolish risk. And those are not the same thing. In fact, when you look at the broader movement of faith-driven entrepreneurship or faith-driven entrepreneurs today, now I just want to say something there. When I refer to faith-driven entrepreneurs, I'm referring to the movement, the entity, faith-driven entrepreneurship, which has inspired this, I would say, broader vision of ours, and especially the topic for the entrepreneurs, which we believe has got a calling from God in their life. So we're referring to their work, but we're also referring to the individual being of faith and a faith-driven entrepreneur. So it's kind of like collectively both. I don't want to steal their work, but I definitely want to give credit where it's due. So when we look at this movement, the faith-driven entrepreneurship, something becomes very clear. They don't avoid the marketplace. They run into it. They build. They create. They invest. They take bold steps into uncertainty, but not randomly, intentionally. Because the idea is this: we are not just here to survive. We are here to create. We are here to multiply. We are here to make an impact. That's actually built into the DNA of the faith-driven entrepreneur. The belief that God is the original creator, the original builder, and the original entrepreneur. And we are invited into that process, not passively, actively, which means something very important. If you remove risk completely, you remove creation. If you remove uncertainty, you actually remove faith. Because faith, by definition, requires movement into something that is not fully guaranteed. Now, here's where Proverbs grounds us. Because Solomon doesn't give us a soft, motivational version of risk. He gives us a structured, disciplined reality, a reality-based version of it. Proverbs 21 verse 5 says following, it says, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty." So immediately we see something. Risk is not the problem. Haste is. Impulsiveness is. Emotional decision making is. This is where most entrepreneurs get it wrong. They don't take risks. They take unprepared jumps and call it courage. And Solomon would look at this and say, well, that's not courage, that's just poorly managed ego. Because biblical risk is not about speed, it's about prepared movement. Let me say that again. Risk in Scripture is not reckless movement. It is intentional movement into uncertainty with wisdom. And Solomon gives us another layer. Proverbs 24 verse 27 says, "Put your outdoor work in order and get your fields ready. After that, build your house." And this is strategy, sequence, order. Do the groundwork first, then build. Meaning, before you take financial risk, you need to prepare. You need to understand the landscape, count the costs, structure the move. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. Because while Proverbs warns us against foolish risk, it also quietly warns us against inactivity. Proverbs 13 verse 4 says this, "The soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing, while the soul of the diligent is richly supplied." Notice the tension. The lazy person wants outcomes, but avoids action. He avoids risks, avoids the discomfort, and as a result, gets nothing. So now we have a paradox forming. If you take reckless risk, you lose. If you take no risk, you also lose. And here's the question, what's left? And that's wise risk. Now let's define that properly. Wise financial risk sits in three tensions. First is the conviction versus emotion. Faith-driven entrepreneurs don't move because they feel like it. They move because they are convicted. There's clarity, there's direction, there's an element of purpose. No guarantee of money, no guarantee of success. Secondly, there's the preparation versus paralysis. You prepare thoroughly, but you don't wait forever, because waiting forever is just fear wearing a fancy suit. And then, of course, thirdly, you get stewardship versus multiplication. Last week we spoke about stewardship, managing what you have, but stewardship is not just preservation, it's also multiplication, which means at some point you must deploy what you have been given. And that requires risk. Now let's address something directly, because this is where things get kind of like uncomfortable. Some of you are not struggling with risk, you struggle with fear disguised as wisdom. You say things like, I'm just being careful, I need more time, I'm waiting for the right moment. Meanwhile, months will pass, years will pass, opportunities will be gone, and nothing moves. And Solomon would call that something very specific. He calls it excuses. Proverbs 22 verse 13 says, the sluggard says, there's a lion outside, I'll be killed in the streets. It's almost kind of like sarcastic. The person invents danger to justify inaction. And if we're honest, entrepreneurs, we do this all the time. We overanalyze, we delay, we hesitate, not because the opportunity isn't there, but because we are afraid of what happens if it all fails. Now, contrast that with something we see in faith-driven entrepreneurship. There's this idea of being a holy risk taker. Not reckless, not careless, but willing to step into spaces where outcomes are not guaranteed. Because the mission actually matters. Because here's the truth. Faith-driven entrepreneurs are not just building businesses. We are building impact systems, financial, social, spiritual impact systems. We believe that our work is part of something bigger, that business is not separate from calling. It is part of it, which means risk is not just about profit. It's about purpose. And that changes how you approach money completely, because now the question is not how do I avoid losing money? The question becomes, what is the cost of not stepping into what I've been called to build? Now, let's balance this before someone quits their job tomorrow and blames this episode, because Proverbs is still very clear. Not all risk is good. Proverbs 27 verse 12 says, the prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty. So wisdom still evaluates risk, still measures the downside, still considers consequences. This is where financial maturity comes in. But wise risk ask, or wise entrepreneurs ask, what is the downside? Can I absorb it? What is the timeline? What is the worst case scenario? And importantly, who have I sought counsel from? In previous episodes, we talked about the importance of having wise counsel in your decision making. And you can see in this series of wisdom how every topic is not a topic on its own, but it's a collective topic. Topics that intertwine with one another to bring this ultimate wisdom, because Solomon didn't only talk about, wealth and wisdom and leadership. He talked about everything collectively. Even Proverbs 11 verse 14 says, where there is no guidance, a people falls. But in abundance of counselors, there is safety. Risk without counsel is arrogance. Risk without or with counsel is strategy. Now let's bring in something deeply uncomfortable again. Solomon, the man who wrote it all, the man who understood wisdom, still failed in parts of his life. He accumulated wealth, he accumulated power, he accumulated this massive influence, and then slowly began ignoring his own principles. Principles of excess, compromise, drift, which brings us back to the same warning from last week, the Solomon's paradox that I spoke about. You can understand risk, you can teach it, you can even succeed in risk, and still destroy yourself if you stop listening to wisdom. So here's a real warning for entrepreneurs. Success can make you less careful. Growth can make you less disciplined. Money can make you less dependent on God, and that's when risk becomes dangerous again. Because now it's no longer faith-driven, it's kind of like ego-driven, and ego-driven risk eventually collapses. I want to say it always collapses. So what does practical, wise, faith-driven financial risk actually look like? Let's bring it down to earth. First, start with clarity and not with opportunity. Just because something is profitable doesn't mean it's yours to pursue. Second, prepare deeply. Understand the numbers, the model, the downside. Faith is not absence of thinking. And because you think, you're not procrastinating. It is part of the due diligence process. Third, move when conviction is clear. At some point, analysis must turn into action. Fourth, limit the blast radius. Don't bet everything on one move unless you are prepared to lose everything. Even Ecclesiastes, written by Solomon, says, invest in 7 ventures, yes, in 8. You do not know what disaster may come. Diversification is biblical. Apparently, risk management isn't a modern invention. Fifth, stay accountable. People who can challenge your thinking, have them around you, not just agree with you. And finally, remember this, the goal is not to avoid loss. The goal is to be faithful in movement. Because if you needed a mic drop moment, this is it. Not taking the risk God is calling you to is also a form of disobedience. And let that sit in for a second. We love talking about the risks we take, but we rarely talk about the risks we avoid. But both shape our lives. Both shape our calling. Both shape our impact. So the question is not, should I take risk? Because you already are. Every day you delay, every opportunity you ignore, every step you don't take, that is also a decision. That is also risk. So the real question becomes, are you taking faithful risks? Or are you living in comfortable disobedience? Because one builds purpose and the other one just builds regret. I really want you to live in that moment collectively with the entrepreneur. And if you know an entrepreneur and often find yourself in a spot of wondering what they think about, here's a short version of that. There's a moment most entrepreneurs don't talk about. And it's not the pitch, it's not the deal closing, it's not the launch. It's that quiet moment, usually late at night, when everything is still and you're sitting there staring at numbers or a blank page or just your own thoughts, and you realize something. If I take this step, things could change. Not slightly, but massively. And not just for the better, sometimes for the worse too. And that's the real moment of risk. Not the Instagram version, not the highlight reel, the one that is quiet, personal, and slightly terrifying. Because now it's not theory anymore, it's responsibility. And let me tell you something most people get wrong about risk. They think risk feels like excitement. It actually doesn't. It feels like tension. It feels like standing between two versions of your life. The one you can control and the one you're being called into. And the gap between those two, that gap is actually where faith lives. When Solomon writes about diligence, planning, and wisdom, he's not writing from theory. He's writing as someone who built something enormous. He built a kingdom. He built systems, trade, infrastructure, wealth that most of us cannot even conceptualize. But here's the part that don't sit with long enough. Solomon didn't inherit a finished system. David, his father, David gave him a foundation. But Solomon had to build. He had to expand. He needed to take the risks from alliances, open trade routes, make decisions where the outcome wasn't guaranteed, and every one of those decisions carried weight. Because when you operate at that level, your risks don't just affect you, they affect people, they affect families, economies, nations. Now bring that down to your world, because maybe you're not running a kingdom, but you're building something, and you're actually building a kingdom as well. You're building something like a business, a team, a career, a future for your family. And the same principle applies. Every financial decision you make is not isolated. It has a ripple effect. And that's why risk feels heavy, because it should. But here's where most people get stuck. They confuse weight with warning. Just because something feels heavy doesn't mean it's wrong. Sometimes it means it matters. There's a story I keep coming back to when I think about this, and you all know the story that I'm about to tell. It's not directly from Proverbs, but it sits perfectly within its wisdom. The parables of the talents, of course. A master gives 3 servants resources. So one gets 5, the other one 2, the other one 1. Then he leaves. No instructions, no step-by-step guide, just responsibility. And when he returns, the first 2 servants have multiplied what they've been given. The third, he buried it, playing it safe, avoided risk. And his reasoning sounds familiar. His reasoning, like, I was afraid, not lazy, not rebellious, afraid. And here's the uncomfortable part. The master doesn't say, at least you protected it. He calls him wicked and lazy. And that should bother you a little. It bothers me definitely. Because it completely reframes how we think about financial safety. Playing it safe is not always wisdom. Sometimes it's actually disobedience wearing that responsible outfit. Now, before someone spirals into quitting their job again and launching a startup tomorrow, relax, because the other 2 servants didn't gamble the money. They didn't throw it into chaos. They worked it. They applied it. They engaged with it. They took calculated, intentional risk. And that's the distinction. Biblical risk is not about adrenaline. It's about engagement with responsibility. So let's make this painfully practical. There are entrepreneurs sitting in 2 different traps right now. The first group, you know exactly what you should be doing next. You've done the research, you've run the numbers, you've spoken to the people, your counsel's there, you've prayed about it, and still you haven't moved. Not because you don't know, but because you're waiting for certainty. But I want to tell you that certainty is not coming. Because if it did, it wouldn't require faith. The second group, you move fast, you act quickly, you take all the risks, but if you're honest, you don't always prepare properly. You skip processes, you skip the due diligence, you trust instinct more than wisdom, and sometimes you clean up messes that could have been avoided. And both groups need the same thing, alignment. Not more courage, not more caution, alignment. Alignment between conviction, wisdom, and action. And this is where the entrepreneurial mindset that's driven by faith becomes powerful, because it introduces something most businesses and most business frameworks ignore: surrender. Not passivity, not weakness, not lack of courage, but surrender of control over outcomes. Because here's the truth nobody likes saying out loud: you can do everything right and still fail. You can do many things wrong and still succeed for a season, which means outcomes are not the ultimate measure. Faithfulness is. Now let's go back to Solomon for a second, because his life gives us warning that should sit with every ambitious person. Solomon had everything. He had wisdom, he had wealth, he had influence, he had success, and still he drifted. Not because he didn't know better, but because he stopped applying what he knew. And success made it easier to ignore correction. And that's the real danger of financial growth. Not loss, drift, slow, subtle, almost invisible. Until one day, you wake up with everything you wanted and realize something is off. So when we talk about taking financial risk, we're not just talking about money, we're talking about direction. Who are you becoming through the risks that you take? Are your decisions pulling you closer to purpose or further from it, because not all growth is good growth. Not all profit is healthy profit, and not all opportunities are assignments. At some point in your journey, you will make a decision that cannot be fully calculated. You'll have the data, you'll have the advice, you'll have the logic, but there will still be a gap. And in that gap, you will have to decide, do I stay where it's safe, or do I step into what I believe I've been called to build? And that decision will not feel comfortable. It will feel exposing, because now it's not just about business anymore, it's about trust. And here's the truth, you don't need to take every risk, you just need to take the right ones. The ones aligned with purpose, the ones prepared with wisdom, the ones surrendered in faith, because when those three align, risk stops being reckless and starts becoming transformational. So don't just ask, what if this fails? Also ask, what if I never step into it? Because one leads to lessons and the other one leads to regret. And regret is far more expensive currency than actual loss.